we'll get this cracking. We'll get the formal bit over and done with. But I would like to open this session to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of the land that I am living and working on, the Ngunnawal people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. And then I want to give just a very brief introduction to what we're thinking about with this panel. And this is probably saying things that, well, everyone knows, but this has been quite a year for those of us writing, researching, teaching, publishing Australian literature. So we exist at the intersection of two sectors, tertiary education and the arts, which, as you all know, have taken a battering at the hands of COVID-19 and, quite frankly, at the hands of our federal government. And before COVID, even when we started planning this panel, we were already responding to a set of circumstances that seemed to suggest a potential loss of institutional support for the discipline of Australian literary studies. But I think this conference shows, and that conversation that we just had before, shows just how readily, in the face of this, we keep doing the work. We keep doing the work of doing this writing and imagining, teaching our students to know and be critical about our cultures and their histories, and that work of amplifying and interrogating the stories that are told here. So I kind of feel like in 2020, this moment in 2020, when the ground is shifting under our feet, in some destabilising and some really productive and heartening ways, it seems to be a really good time to talk about value. And when we're thinking about value, we're thinking about a few different things. One is the question of how we articulate the value of the work that we do in the kinds of advocating that we have to do for the sectors that we form part of. I'm also thinking about how our work is valued by the institutional structures that circumscribe the funding and the possibilities of the very possibility of doing our work. But also for me, this question of how we as critics and scholars and teachers and writers are involved in the work of defining value and indeed generating value, literary value, in ways that can shore up inequality, and the way that we're all involved in that work in various ways. So what we wanted to do in this panel is to open up a conversation, and I think we've got a pretty good foundation for that with the people here, a conversation about value in the field that we'd like you all to participate in. So each of our speakers will give a very brief discussion paper, and then we'll open up for questions, and I'll pose questions to you in the audience as well as the speakers as well, and feel free to participate either via chat or verbally with your cameras on or off, however you feel comfortable. So we'll go alphabetically because it seems as fair a way as any, and I'd like to start with Lachlan, if you're there, Lachlan. Lachlan Brown is a senior lecturer in English at Charles Sturt University, Wagga Wagga. He is the author of Limited Cities and Lunar Inheritance, both with Giramondo. And Lachlan's poetry has been published in various journals, including Antipodes, Cordite, and Rabbit. He's previously been involved in judging the Gwen Harwood Poetry Prize and the Mary Gilmore Poetry Prize. And he's currently the Vice President of the Barunga Writers Centre in Wagga Wagga. And he's also the New South Wales representative of ASIL. So Lachlan, over to you.
Julieanne, and it's great to be here. I want to acknowledge as well that I'm speaking from Wiradjuri land here in Wagga Wagga, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I've got a little provocation paper, so I might just read that. It's perhaps less positive than I had hoped at the beginning of writing it. So, and I'll share a slide perhaps at the end. In my institution, we have people whose jobs titles say things like research verifier or research and creative works verifier, or on some occasions, casual creative works verifier. That's what their email signatures tell me about their roles. These people are lovely and genial. Their job is to prompt me to gather the required information so that poetry can be properly added to our research repository. It wouldn't do to have any unverified poetry. If, for example, a poem is to be counted as research, the Creative Works Verifier has a checklist of requirements before it's sent to a group called the panel. The Creative Works verifier has to make sure that I've uploaded a copy of the publication. I've included a published bio that confirms my link to the university. If not, I have to make an additional declaration that I am indeed linked to the university, that the Lachlan Brown who published the poem is the Lachlan Brown who works for the institution. The verifier prompts me to write a statement outlining the research question I was answering, the theoretical or research background, how the work contributes to new knowledge, how the work should be valued and measured in terms of impact. It seems to be someone's job as well to slightly change these headings and criteria every couple of years in order to guard against the lowering of quality and to better guide us as we submit things to the panel. The panel is made up of a group of academics from across the university who may or may not have any expertise in creative writing. The panel meets to discuss the creative works, the research statements, whether the verification has occurred, and how many research points to assign to a creative work. At the end of the exercise, one can be designated as research active according to the points you've achieved. But we know for poetry, verification is a strange category. In his famous 1579 essay, The Defense of Poesy, Sir Philip Sidney wrote, quote, "Now for the poet, he affirms, or he nothing affirms, and therefore never lieth." I'm yet to use this in a research statement, but I'm tempted to, particularly with the replication crisis enveloping fields like psychology and medicine. I've also taken to dwelling upon Gwen Harwood's line from Suburban Sonnet when I'm meant to be writing an impact statement. That line is, "Once she played for Rubinstein, who yawned." So there's impact for you. There's something about the nature of poetry, isn't there, that seems to resist normal processes of verification. Poetry is at war with measures of value, and it often makes peace with its own insignificance. Last night, David Stavinger posted a poem on Instagram with the lines, quote, "There is little at stake in poetry unless there is much at stake outside of a CV." We pray, don't we, that there is much at stake outside of a CV. But for those of us who have jobs, this is a bit of a rich statement to utter. We're part of an unjust system that's predicated on the precarious and exploited labour of so many creative writers, teachers and researchers. Speaking about poetry and lies, my former colleague David Gilby also reminded me of Les Murray's lines in Poetry and Religion. "You can't pray a lie," said Huckleberry Finn. "You can't poe one either." Well, maybe Murray is correct, but I want to recount a little story that makes me think about Murray's words in a different way. When I first started here at Wagga, I taught a creative writing class. In that subject was a really talented young writer who always seemed kind of too cool for the regional scene. And the workshops were filled with like really eager education students who wanted to write limericks and sing quains. And this guy was, had this Justin Timberlake look, intense blue eyes. He could share sophisticated and stylish poetry in class, but he couldn't quite get his act together to hand anything in, as in he never submitted one thing to me for assessment. So Justin, we'll call him, failed my class, but I did see him later being cool in the town with a cool other student and her parents. In the next year of teaching, our tutor Derek Motion alerted me to a strange situation in which another student, let's just call him Graham, had suddenly transformed himself into a good poet after submitting some really not so good stuff the year before and not being able to pass. So when I took a deep dive into Graham's work, I used Twitter bios, profile pics, and some of the lines to trace it to a Tumblr that was registered to none other than Justin, or at least someone with Justin's profile pic. So instead of submitting his own creative writing to gain credit at uni, it turned out that Justin had given poems to a friend who needed them. That was a boss move, I reckon. And I still think it's kind of impressive. It spoke to a delinquency and indifference that lifted Justin's creativity into an unsanctioned realms. You can't poe a lie, but maybe Justin did, or maybe he was poeing a marvelous kind of higher order truth. Soon after this incident, and maybe because of it, I landed the Sisyphean gig of investigating every single case of plagiarism, collusion, and contract cheating for my faculty. Joy. It means that my days are filled with close readings of essays, reflection statements, observations of toddlers in preschools. Often my goal is to determine whether certain indicators, a low Turnitin score, the use of running head on page 2, falsified references, the inclusion of a doctoral dissertation in the reference list, whether these are enough to prove a case of contract cheating or assessment outsourcing. Then I might give the student a call for a conversation or viva. This has made me into an extremely cynical person. As far as I can tell, lots of students are outsourcing, those studying to be social workers, high school teachers, early childhood teachers, pastors in churches, even my most engaged student in contemporary Australian writing who admitted to buying a research essay for $170 that compared Tim Winton's The Shepherd's Hut with AB Original's rap album Reclaim Australia. Reflecting on this faculty role, I'm aware that I've now become subsumed into parts of the Veracity machine. I'm yet to update my own email signature after about 3 years in the role, but maybe I should. Lachlan Brown, first year English essay verifier, theological reflective practice verifier, educational lesson plan verifier, creative works verifier. I wanted to end with Sam Wagon-Watson poem because I think it draws some of these kind of threads together. So I'll just try and share my screen to share it with you. You can see it. Can you see it there?
Yep.
Yep. It's called Baranga Wire Songs. Sorry, I'll just see. The poem, yeah, it was published in Poetry magazine in Chicago in 2016. For me, Baranga Writers Centre encapsulates these interesting transactions between creativity, writing, and a tertiary institution. It was set up with land and building grants from the uni and on uni grounds, but it doesn't receive much institutional support and less so. The lease is strange and no one wants to touch it or explain it. Baranga receives funding from Create New South Wales, but it pays most of this to the writers who stay as residents. A real estate agent would describe the building as rustic. Its position is tenuous, gripping a hillside toward the edge of campus. It looks up the hill to clumps of boulders and down the hill to the university winery. But because of its history of writers' residencies, Baranga may be one of the most written about locations in regional New South Wales. Poets like Ali Cobby-Eckermann, Ron Pretty, Gina Woodhouse, Andy Kassane have all written Baranga poems. And these are free, I think, from being verified as creative research because they're produced by those who come into the uni, those who are outside and inside, to take up Kate Notsky's terms, of the university. So Wagon-Watson's poem presents the song of the fence line, echoing and reversing the fencing of song lines that has accompanied the colonisation of this piece of land. He writes of wire song on cold wind, musing low, tension, wang, and resonance. He describes the evening as Cormac McCarthy-like, drawing this moment into a strange prophetic relation with the poem's eventual US place of publication. There are hints at writerly ambition, invocation, the power of language, but the poet's desire is for the wire song that stands outside civilized nights of too much consumer discontent. So Philip Sidney wrote in his defense of the planet-like music of poetry. The simple wire song, therefore, doesn't exist to be verified. And I think it comforts me a little to hear about songs that are free from the fixed and formulated gaze or my own complicit investigations into the veracity of writing. And I might just finish there with that might end my provocation. I don't know how to give that back.
Thanks so much, Lachlan. What do? Do you know how to unshare? Yep. There we go. Great. Thank you so much. That was just wonderful. Now we have a McMahon and a Martin. I think we'll go Martin first. I don't know.
Oh yeah, she always wants to go first.
She has the best background, so maybe we'll leave it like that.
Yeah, quite.
So Sue Martin, like any of these people, there's no introduction here, but I'll do it anyway. Sue Martin is Professor of English at La Trobe University. She was Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor Research at La Trobe until 2019 for her sins, and a member, that was me, not her, just to point that out, and a member of the ARC Excellence in Research Australia 2018 Humanities and Creative Arts Research Evaluation Committee. And this is Sue. She's done some research on Australian literature and culture, which I think is a beautiful understatement there, Sue. But over to you.
Thank you. I'm particularly taken by the fact I now look quite ghostly in front of my background because the sun is coming directly into this room. I had to shut the blind. Now I've got that introduction because after Lachlan's lovely poetic elegiac piece, I'm actually going to talk from the the point of view of the evaluators here, because I'm going to talk about ERA and that kind of valuation of what we do. So, and all that verification that Lachlan was talking about is feeding directly into the assessment, the metrification, if you like, of our work, the artificial values that we are hedged about with. So I'm going to speak about some of the acronyms of value, which increasingly define and decline our research as academics in Australia and Australian literature. The ERA, the FORs, and I was going to talk about the Q1s, but I think I'll run out of time if I do that. But I'm happy to take that up later. So most of you will know how ERA works, but I'm going to go over that just a little bit. And it's a very internal system, as you'll also know. The ranking of excellence in Australian universities is ranked by this 3-yearly formally, and now 5-yearly, we hope, Excellence in Research Australia process, which uses field of research codes to define a field. And the new FOR codes came out yesterday, if you haven't seen them, and if you're not a nerd like me who immediately went through them with a fine-tooth comb. And I'm also willing to talk about those because the Australian literature ones are quite interesting and controversial, I think. The outputs of university researchers go through various stages of review in the ERA. And the first of those for peer-reviewed areas, which of course we're in, is expert peer review from disciplinary experts who read a proportion of the nominated top 30% from institutions, which then go to the rec panels, and that's when I was on the Research Evaluation Committee, who consider both those reports. They also read the outputs and combine that with considering a variety of metrics, because you can't leave those metrics out. And of course, the verification that Lachlan was talking about, everything has to be verified as it goes in to assign value to individual UOEs, as they're called, units of evaluation. That's what those UOEs align usually with departments, with programs or disciplines within universities. So ERA is a boon to areas like literary studies and Australian literary studies, to the extent that it acknowledges that metrical analysis is not the only way to go, that citation data and journal impact factors don't measure most of the humanities and social science disciplines, that it's not a good fit or representation of value in those areas. And because it acknowledges and offers ways of measuring, however horrendous those may be, as Lachlan's just pointed out, for the creative arts. So it gives some standing to the creative arts, and certainly in the managerial role that I was filling for the last 5 years, it gave me some leverage to defend and put forward the creative arts and their outputs as legitimate research. But it also, of course, uncovers its own problems. And now I'm going to try and share my screen to show you one problem which you're probably also familiar with. No, except I've got so many things open that it's going to, no, that's not it. Yeah, I can't find my PowerPoint. I hope I'm not sharing some private document there. I think I'm just sharing the program, which is not much good. Hang on, I'll have to find the PowerPoint. So what I'm
not sharing it all yet, Sue.
Oh, well, that's handy, really, isn't it? So why am I not sharing my PowerPoint? Wow. I may not be able to share this with you because I can't see it. Oh, there it is. I think that's it. I'll see if that will share with you. So what I'm trying to share is a picture of the way that the national institutions which score a 5 for FLRs in different disciplines are massively unbalanced, STEM versus HAS. So at the bottom there, the number of institutions getting a 5, psychology, medical and health sciences, technology, engineering, earth sciences, physical sciences, etc. and at the top are the humanities and social science disciplines. So the ERA process works out quite unevenly, which may be because Australia is just really good at STEM and shit at HAS, but I don't believe that, and I don't think any of you believe that. So the more likely explanation is that peer review works differently to metrical measurement, and may even be that peer review is a little more accurate and critical. In terms of I'll show you another picture which is basically the same thing but might be a bit easier to read on people's screens. So alongside of this kind of median problem, you also have that across the last 3 years of 3 rounds of ERA, there's been a sort of settling in the middle for the peer discipline. So a lot of people scoring 3 at world standard as it's ranked in ERA, and a lot less of spread up to, well, virtually no one at 1 and very few at 5, whereas in the STEM disciplines, everything's moved up towards 5 in a magical way. So for Australian studies, I think there's one more issue with ERA, and that is cultural cringe, which is alive and well and which is fed by some of the international rankings, which regard international partnerships, international publication, and sets of international standards as the international measures of excellence, so that any Australian-based journal is going to be regarded as second rate, even though that is the obvious journal for Australian studies, whether that's history or literary studies. And that's quite difficult to battle against, whether that's within ERA judgments or other kinds of judgments at universities, as I'm sure most of you have encountered. So we're supposed to come up with a provocation here. My concern about these rankings, you know, they're not doing a whole lot at the moment, but they, between the ERA research rankings, which these are, and the industry engagement and impact rankings, which came in 2018 and will almost certainly appear in 2023, it's very likely that the government will attach funding to some aspects of these rankings and to the likely teaching rankings at some point. And that's the point when we need to be very concerned about how these rankings operate and how they represent us, represent the HAS disciplines, which, you know, already have been valued oddly by the current government, and therefore how we get funded and supported and valued nationally as well as internationally. My provocation, which is more of a provocation to, you know, other Associate Pro Vice Chancellor of Research than to anyone here, is to say that, you know, the peer review is not the problem, it's the metrical ranking. At the very least, the two methods should be combined. It shows perhaps more rigour, I think, in the peer review that it hasn't suddenly magically produced 5s across all areas, and that they should be combined. And the other provocation, I suppose, is the proliferation of the kinds of work that Lachlan's talking about, which is taking up a mind-boggling amount of time within universities that could be spent on other forms of work, and is only going to get worse. And I think that's reflected in the review of the Australia-New Zealand standard research classification codes, that instead of replacing those with algorithms or, you know, much more refined machine learning methods that might have been more sensible, you know, instead we've proliferated a huge additional set of codes as if they could somehow pin down research in a better way. And in fact, I think what they've done is generate a whole lot of anomalies. So I'll stop there. It's nowhere to, you know, just shows what management can do to you, that Lachlan has been so, you know, poetic and lyrical. And I've talked to you about numbers and charts. Yeah, I'll show you some. The good bit of the new codes is the Indigenous Studies Code. The bad bit is that we still have this Australian literature, excluding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature, which has been changed for history. Australian history now exists as a thing. and Australian literature exists as a thing excluding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature. So there you go.
It's not very cheerful, Sue.
Sorry, you said provocation, not celebration.
No, I didn't ask for cheer. It's true, I didn't. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about that classification and the ways in which we do and don't fit within that classification and what we do in the discipline as well. So
yes,
yeah, and the work we have to do. Lots of different kinds of work we need to do to address that. So thank you very much for that picture, from explaining some things that hadn't made sense to me before. So thank you.
Yes.
We have more questions for you later.
I can see some chat questions there, which I'm more than happy.
Great. Firstly, we'll hear from Elizabeth, from Liz McMahon. Elizabeth McMahon teaches in the School of Arts and Media at UNSW.
Sure do.
What's that?
I said I sure do.
She has edited journals in the arts and humanities continuously for 22 years. When I read that, I just stopped for a minute. 22 years, Liz, my goodness. Her 2016 monograph, Islands and the Literary Imagination, won 2 national awards, and her forthcoming monograph, Transvestite Frontiers, will be published by Sydney University Press. With Brigitte Olivers, she has edited 4 collections of essays, the most recent on Antigone Kefala. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Thanks very much. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Bejiga land, and to say that it's just delightful to be here. And because I'm teaching, I can't participate much in this conference, and that's very disappointing, but it's just lovely to be here now. And I'm going to be speaking from my experience of this 22 years editing journals, and the ways that it has shaped my academic career, and in ways that I didn't necessarily anticipate, expect or want at the time. But it has certainly been a very rewarding career, in that I'm always at the threshold between the university and the creative arts, and brokering that territory, editing Southerly, especially given the identity of Southerly, which is that you do have peer-reviewed work, you have non-peer-reviewed essays, we have a lot of poetry and fiction, we publish a lot of work. So we please neither master, in a sense. We don't please the universities, who would be really happy for us to cut out the creative work in order to increase its value. And we don't please the funding bodies, because we are too attached to the idea of the essay and the scholarly essay, the peer-reviewed essay. And so this is the remit, the happy identity, and a very worthwhile one of Southerly. There aren't many more left with that kind of identity in the country. And I think it's a very valuable space to keep working in. I think it's a very valuable space for writers to write in as well. But it's not a particularly easy space to continue in, and Southerly is very much under threat at the moment. But because of that role, which I have, I really treasure, I have done a lot of work with writers' festivals in both Tasmania and Sydney, and involved in kind of panels between those different spaces and judging work for the literary organisations and arts organisations, etc. And this has been the forefront of my mind also as a teacher, about how we are educating our students to have careers, to have lives in a literary life, if you like, in ways that we know that the university is not going to be able to sustain. They're not going to all be able to be academics, and maybe they wouldn't want to be as well. But that I think that the thinking around what we in literary studies provide to people is not at all clear. And I think at the best, at my institution, perhaps elsewhere, one of the arguments that's put forward all the time is about, can you see me? Oh, yeah. Is about the soft skills, hard skills, that, that we will provide the soft skills to the valuable hard skills. And the experience I'm just going to talk about in a minute is that I want to say that these so-called soft skills are career skills in themselves, and that we are not just the add-on, and literary studies is not the add-on to the sensible career path, but does in itself constitute a way of living and a career path, if you like, in the world. So that's my preamble. And in 2019, I convened a day-long workshop, and Bridget Rudy was there and Fiona Morrison was there as ASL representatives. And this was on the topic of literary value in Australia, responding to these kinds of questions. And it included writers and academics, arts officers from the funding bodies and from writers' centres, from regional as well as city metropolitan centres. There were editors and publishers, executives of literary, scholarly and community associations, the English Teachers Association, and a range of extraordinarily enterprising people who have startups in literary studies. And this was prompted by a year-long program of discussions for small literary organisations. And again, Bridget Rooney came to one of these in her role as ASL president, that were being conducted by Writing New South Wales, and they were started by Katrina Menzies-Pike. So thanks to Katrina, I know who's talking a bit later in the week. And so I learned this was an incredibly valuable discussion between a whole range of different literary organisations. And there are two really important things that I think might be useful in this context. And the first was that I didn't know about the range of literary activities in the place that I live in. These were, I was continually bowled over by young, interesting and successful people, young people who had set up businesses in poetry. Like there's one organisation that has like 17 employees and an organisation that, focuses on poetry. Miles Merrill was there from the Poetry Slam and talked about the way that he had set that up. And there were many others as well. And it struck me that there were people that in my role as academic and as literary editor had never actually come across with these kind of really entrepreneurial, to use, I'm sorry, I know it's the neoliberal, fetish, but to have that people who had gone against what I thought were the traditional paths of academic life. I myself had been a publisher before I came back to the university, but this was very different and the different world, and it seemed like they were having the best time. And I thought this would be wonderful for our students. This would be wonderful. This is what our students need to see, that you don't just have to think to go home and say, look, I'm sorry, I want to do English, but to say, or literary studies in some way, but I'm saying, look, this is going to be great. And I'm going to have a life that I can fashion for myself that's going to be sustaining in a whole range of different ways. So that was one thing I learned. And the second thing that was really clear from these discussions was the need for literary advocacy in Australia. And that this needs to come from, in my view, and this is something I'm asking today really, from the collective of literary associations. And if we're talking about value, I think that what's important is that there is no one value, and that there are a whole range of different values that are not necessarily valued by those in the pool of literary studies. So what became apparent on this day of the workshop was in all of these organisations, it did kind of pan out after a while, but there was quite a lot of anxiety, misunderstanding regarding what the range of activities that we were all involved in were about. And so the word value itself was contested. The word literature was contested. Everything was a priority or not a priority for various people in the room. And so we came to an agreement that there were various systems of values, and it was not just a compromise, but it was an important registration of the reality of different work that's being done in different ways. Okay, so that might be a truism. What was not a truism, what was not something that I didn't expect that necessarily, but that we do not have an understanding of the connections between those different associations and groups of different values. Okay. So we might think, for instance, and I constantly make the point to funding bodies, that if you get a publication in Southerly and we've edited you very carefully and mentored you over a period of time, this is a very good thing for you to go and publish in other kinds of ways, and find other, publishers, etc. And we have, like I'm sure most magazines do, have lists of people for whom that trajectory has worked. But there are a whole range of people where that's not going to happen, and it might not be the goal for it to happen, or it might be a possibility, but there is no pathway available. So to me, it seems that the work is to be done, and it has not been done in Australia, to map not only the range of activities, but the level of their connection, and to see where these flows are working and where there are obstacles. And whether there might be some room for movement between them. So I'm thinking about community writing groups that do sometimes go into publication, may or may not have a different system of values. But it's not entirely one thing or the other, but that we have to invent ourselves for funding bodies or in one form or another, and there would be people who would be could be captured and moved on in other ways, etc. So this is not being done. So with the great work that David Throsby and Jan Zvar and Paul Crosby did years ago on the kind of cultural economics of literary studies, we have the kind of bones there for a map of some economies of it. But what we do not have is an understanding, a mapping of that complexity, but also just how pervasive it is to Australian culture. If we do to map it all, just how enormously important it is. Yes, in terms of the big publishers and that which is an astonishingly successful industry in Australia, but also to all the categories that, not just funding bodies, but the community understands as having if they don't understand, have an investment in literature and the act of writing. That is not understood, and the connections are not understood. So that to me is the key. If we're going to have literary advocacy, which we clearly need, God help us, since I even wrote the abstract to talk, I think it's got a lot worse. So we have, I don't think we've had it, I don't know if it's been discussed at the conference, but we have still 2 delays on academic leadership appointments in Australian literature. We've had the attack on UWA publishing. We've had further decrease to government funding to writers and literary journals in the last year. I didn't think it could get worse after Brandis, and that was only the beginning. We've got the closure of the Federal Department for the Arts, the relentless full-scale attack on art and humanities from the state and federal governments, right? So this is not going to go away anytime soon. What we need to do is to advocate, and to do that, to our provocation, is to get off the ground and the value system that we operate in, and to understand what other people's are, and to understand where that can, or how that can work together to produce a sense of the very real and pervasive importance of literary culture to Australian life. There you go.
Thank you so much for that, Liz, and for that. I wholeheartedly agree. That question of there are so many deep connections between what we do inside and outside the academy, and I think that often the way that these things are valued, as you said, in relation to Southerly, is predicated on a false distinction between what is inside and what is outside. So I think that's part of that work of actually arguing for those connections. We don't necessarily have to build them. We just need to show that to
make them that's right.
Make them visible where they're already there. So no, I wholeheartedly agree. So now we do have some time for some questions. So I wonder if anyone would like to start. I know we have a question from Christina here in relation to, I think, Sue, this was in relation to the question of the categorisation of Australian literature excluding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature, and Christina's asking, why is this excluded? Has there been a failure of advocacy? Have we not advocated enough for this? Does any of our panels have a view on that?
I don't know. We're talking about the mechanisms of the research, culture. Sue would have a better idea than I would.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the upside, as I pointed out, there's an entire category for Indigenous studies, and because it's the Australia-New Zealand, so there's a big category on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies, which includes a category for literature. And I showed you that one. It's rather oddly for literature and journalism and creative non-fiction, I think was the terminology. So a sort of different category than in the under literature within that Indigenous studies area. So the former configuration we had was Australian literature excluding in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature, and Australian literature, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander literature, that weird notion that they were two separate and separable objects. Now, you know, we've got an entire Indigenous studies area, which is excellent, and one and Maori studies area, and the New Zealand literature has the same division, which is equally odd, I would argue, that New Zealand literature and Maori literature can be separated out in some way. Whereas for some reason, and this may be in fact about the advocacy of the different departments, where Australian history used to have the identical configuration, it is now just Australian history, which I think is a failure. You know, I think if those codings had not included an entire Indigenous area, and let me remark here that as usual I've failed to acknowledge at the beginning, although I did yesterday, that I'm on Tongarong land and should acknowledge their elders past and present. But if there hadn't been that category, it would have been horrendous. But having that category, an entire Indigenous studies category, and the categories underneath it, although some of those categories kind of smush different parts of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practiced together as if they were sort of less significant than the other categories elsewhere. So there's some odd politics going on there. Having that category, I think you could have had Australian literature, which acknowledged that at least post-invasion Australian literature is a complex space, which includes both, particularly because when you then come to use some of those codes for some of their purposes, as in the ARC, you can only use 3 codes. So you're in a kind of complicated space. So it's a very weird thing. And, you know, we don't have Australian politics divided up in those ways. We don't have, you know, we have a few areas. Archaeology is still divided up into Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And similarly, I think there's some questions about that. You know, is settler archaeology not Indigenous archaeology, and vice versa? So yeah, I think it's a failure of our voicing, although I have to say I was pretty vociferous about it in the feedback. So
I might pose a question to everybody here and you can respond in the chat box, and that is about this question of advocacy and what people's thoughts are about how we can do better in advocating for the discipline quite broadly, and the sectors that we are part of. So if anyone has some thoughts about that and want to share them in the chat box, that can continue while we're having this conversation. There's also a question from Maggie asking about what the panel thinks about English being excluded from the attack on the humanities in the recent funding announcement. Do any of you have some thoughts to share on what it means for us as a discipline, and what it means for how we're situated in relation to these kind of governmental and funding regimes?
And actually not just about how it's situated, but actually it's kind of weird. It's like they diss us all the time, and then, but it's it's kind of this,
Worry,
I think it will have an impact on, and I think we do need to think about that. And also I think we need to be careful not to bracket ourselves off from our humanities colleagues to our own advantage and all that kind of stuff. But I thought it was really telling and interesting. And for several days, a lot of us were like, do they mean English language? Do they even know, is this language or literature? And it's now turned out actually it is the very stuff we do. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating and hard to know quite what it all means.
I think that Fiona, I don't know if you're Fiona and I'm misquoting you, so I'm sorry if that's the case, but I remember you wrote a particularly intelligent email when we were discussing this as a group at work about this being a back to the 3 R's kind of agenda. Yeah. And that we fell into that. Yeah.
There'll be a lot of information floating around. Just to flag that ASIL's made a statement, it published a statement about this last Friday after quite a lot of consultation at exec. Simply to register right now 2 things. One, the moment that we're in is the moment of parliamentary recess and thinking. So we're urging significant thought about questions of equity and access. And also a moment in which we as a literary association stand in solidarity with with the disciplines that will constitute the BAs around us. So we may have the plate, but the house might burn down, it seems to me. Just on the question of, it seems to me that from friends in the external directorate of New South Wales Department of Education and Training, that culture wars are alive and well, one. Two, it's a back to basics agenda dominated by the nationals. It's a COVID under darkness moment, that Dan Tehan is an idiot, and that the position that the policymakers take on English starts from the secondary sector. That's their position on what English is.
Yeah.
And in which case it's fortuitous for us because we're still, at least in that document, insofar as it's going to govern anything if it gets through Parliament. Yeah, so I don't know how to formulate a response until Parliament has voted, but yeah, that's what I've got so far.
I'd just say something. Oh, sorry, Julieanne's on.
Go for it, Lachlan. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry. Just a little anecdote. So my dear friend Michael Muhammad Ahmed started a group called Sweatshop Western Sydney Literacy Movement. I remember when he started that, I'm like, why did you call it Literacy Movement? But I think he was really sly and clever at the time, because he could bracket more under that. And I mean, he does a lot of things in a very canny, considered, clever way. But the way he used literacy kind of allowed him to slide between literature, between education, between the creation of literature. It allowed him to get into places and do things that he wouldn't have otherwise done. And I wonder if there's something going on there in terms of the way English is being used in this, but that's just a guess.
We were constantly being badgered to change our name from English because we were so old-fashioned. I mean, we felt like we were a part of the merry men or whatever of England. But it was really just because we have so many education students who are studying English. And it would be preposterous to have a degree where what they need us to do is to equip them for this discipline in the schools, and so therefore we're English. But that's stood us in good stead in this environment, though it's never great to be on the right side of this government's policy on the arts.
That's right. There's a question here from Nicole. Nicole, would you like to say it? You can unmute yourself, actually, if you'd like. Are you there? No? Okay. Oh, there you are, Nicole.
Here I am. Hi guys. I'm just conscious that I don't know who else is here from the AUHE, Australian University Heads of English. I'm no longer on the executive there, but my understanding is they are preparing, or they have had an exec meeting this week, preparing a response similar in the ways that ACEL has been thinking about it, obviously. And I was just wondering whether or not ACEL has fed the ACEL statement to the AUHE, because it would be great, obviously, to see some coordination across those organisations where there's a peak body, that we use some of that amplification where we can.
Yeah.
Obviously, but yeah, I don't think there's anyone here from the exec from AUHE, though I could be wrong.
Oh, Maggie.
Yes, it's a shame because the FOR codes have come out, and so we didn't get a chance to talk about that. But also kind of I had to actually leave early from the meeting, but also preparing a statement that is basically a statement in solidarity with humanities and the importance of the humanities. It feels hard, I guess, because as Tony said in the chat, it's kind of, there's almost like a survivor guilt kind of thing happening, but so that statement's Anthony Allman's working on it, and we're just talking about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thanks, Maggie. I have to say, it's not easy to write It wasn't for the reasons everyone understands. I was meaning to talk to Anne Vickery, Nicole, and I did see her in a Zoom room, but this is where, morning tea would have been good. I could have collared her. We were coming into the prep for this conference and writing the statement at the same time, so there's just a bit of a lag, but I will do that, and the exec will do that.
And I think INASA have also been working on a statement, and that's kind of interesting because they are this interdisciplinary association where some of the people are like freaking out, historians in particular, but also kind of working out, and I know Anne Brewster's been involved in that, but, you know, how you pitch these things in ways that are kind of strategic. I'm actually not that convinced that the equity approach is going to fly, because there's nothing about this government that suggests they actually care about equity. I'm almost thinking, my view is it should be a kind of, do we really want a government that socially engineers, you know, how people live their lives? But it's a kind of how you deal with that. The equity stuff, and Bridget posted something on Facebook about the response from Julieanne. I don't think they actually care about equity.
No.
And there's a lot of lip service to equity in the actual proposal itself as well, with the with the scholarships and extra fund and that kind of thing. But we do also have another question from Tully. Tully, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thanks. Oh, geez, those were just such great presentations. They all brought something really different to this. I'm at Flinders University. I work on a project called Laboratory Adelaide, the Value of Culture, that for the last few years has been looking at how some of these issues play in that whole arts and culture sphere. So looking at the Brandis affair and all these sorts of things to this moment. And there are a few things in there that I think could be useful for this debate that I wondered what the panelists might think about. And in particular, that's around the evidence and the work that gets put, the labour that gets put onto the sector to constantly provide different forms of evidence. And so, sorry, no, that's not the right evidence. It needs to be this kind of evidence. Oh, no, sorry, that's not the evidence we want. What we actually wanted was this kind of evidence. And then you get into that space, people who go, well, I've got the tool that can create the evidence that you need. And in the UK, there's evidence, again, that there is that there's a feedback loop between the department that's asking for the evidence of the sector and then the consultants who go out and make money selling that to the sector. But I think something that we really need to think about for us is that there's never going to be the right kind of evidence, because that can't do it. If you look at the, say, so-called creative industries at the moment, there is so much evidence of such a huge contribution to the economy, and it's not having purchase in the debate. So then even to the point where very recently, someone who I quite respect, Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, in a webinar said to the sector, you need to step forward with confidence when you're presenting the evidence. So now we've got essentially, what were you wearing? How short was your miniskirt when you were asked these questions about, you know, the evidence for what you contribute to the sector? So I actually think we need to stop quantifying the evidence and actually think about the reception of the evidence, which is where my project is working now. How people make meaning out of evidence, and what blockages or roadblocks there. And I just wondered what the panel might think about that provocation.
Yeah, Ramsay centres don't need evidence, because for the right, it's self-explanatory. It's just there. It's just there that this culture is super important for the nation or for who we are. And so the fact that they'd need that sort of evidence is very funny, I think. But they want to put that on everyone else.
Tully, I agree with you, because I think that all the cultural economics that is being done, say, on the literary environment with the Australia Council, it's so compelling, you know, because that industry makes so much money. There is And that work has been well received by the Australia Council, but then, and it's used to formulate their policy, so that's very good. But then it's also, they're subject to national direction of the government. So that has not been allowed to play out fully. But I do think that the way that we are, what's the word I'm looking for? We can't second guess, is that you have to say, you have to give all the evidence about where your publications are going to, for instance, the diversity of that community quite properly. But there's always going to be something you don't do. And part of it, in relation to what you said about who's receiving it, is that where I think it's become increasingly difficult for artists themselves, writers, and for literary magazines, for small music ensembles. there's not one funded small musical ensemble in Sydney anymore, not one. This is a combination, chamber orchestra, whatever, but there's not one. From the combination of the state and federal governments, right? So what's happening is, who are these assessments going to? And they're going to a new peer review process, which is, any of us at any point can nominate to go on them, and we should. But the people who, the responses I get back on Southerly, do not know what it is, haven't bothered to read the application, and they are, I don't know what their reason for being on the committee is. But so this is, since then, it's all gone very, very, there's no literature board, there's no sense of value. As Lachlan's saying, you don't need to make that case of value when it's the Ramsay Centre, but even when now it has become increasingly dispersed in the name of equity and diversity, which I of course support, but there's no rhyme or reason anymore. And so every time you get feedback and say you've got to be like this, you do it this way, then it says you've got to be like that. Yeah, that's happening all the time, Tully, for sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Other responses to Tully's question, because I think that's a really important one in terms of what kinds of evidence can we provide of the value of our sector, but who is listening? How can we actually get any leverage from these kinds of claims that we're making about the value of the sector? Any other thoughts on that from the audience as well as our panellists?
I think it feeds into that question you posed before, Julieanne, around advocacy, because there's a link between, how we advocate and what we put forward when we do advocate. So maybe people have some views about that part of the question.
Hello, can I just come in on that, about the relationship between the secondary and tertiary sectors? Because some of your strongest advocates are the people you've taught who are now English teachers. And the English Teachers Associations are very strong professional bodies. There's a major international conference online next week that was going to be in Sydney, but it's going ahead. And I would think that there's a very important role to liaise between the secondary associations and the tertiary associations, because your strongest advocates, or our strongest advocates, are people who've benefited from what they've learned and are using it in their teaching. So that would be perhaps an avenue that hasn't been explored very much. I'm not sure.
Julieanne,
Yes.
just an observation that from Liz's account of what is actually happening on the ground, and from Yvonne's point about, which is reflected in the outcry, it seems to me, from the general public about the idea of the arts degree not being available widely and openly across all ranges of possible secondary school student choices, is that there's the greatest possible disconnect that we've seen yet across a lot of vectors between, what in sense the practice is and where the policy sits. So the conversion point has to be rhetorical. I mean, there's stuff in the chat about trade, talking to tradies, but a version of that is what is the rhetorical strategy? How do we get the people who need to listen without becoming implicit in an economic argument that we then can't win, an unfalsifiable economic argument we can't win? But the reality is that the creative arts produce this extraordinary economic return. So where is that's my point, with the disconnect that enormous now between practice and, you know, bananas policy. What is that? What is the language set? What is its direction? Who do we speak to? Is there a series of advocates?
I mean, I don't have the answer to that, but I mean, the thing that comes most immediately to mind is both the building and the articulating of those connections and those networks that are already there. You know, and it's a case that ASIL's been making for years, and that we're not just about scholarship, but also about writers and writing, and that kind of argument, I think, needs to be diffused, you know, and made more strongly. But I don't know what thoughts other people have about that.
The government likes writers' festivals, and I think they were included, weren't they, recently in the rescue package, because they like anything spectacular. and events are fine. But anything that which people, you know, writing in their home on their own or anything is not so supported or anything. So I think that I know that the Melbourne Writers' Festival has been experimental in terms of its outreach, and I'd be interested to know how that's gone. So I think that there might be ways of doing it, but that we're not, certainly there are, that we're not thinking about. I'm sure that there are, and through existing organisations too.
I mean, we've run a little bit over time, and it's the kind of thing where I just wish we could all just kind of take this to the bar and keep talking for 4 hours. I'd really enjoy that. And I think this is a question, we haven't even really skirted the surface of these really difficult questions, but I think we've cracked them open a little, I think. And I want to thank everyone for coming along and being willing to participate in this conversation. I think let's keep the chat box open for a little bit in terms of ideas about how to best to continue this conversation as well, how to progress it in what kinds of forms. But I'd just like to thank you all, especially our panellists, who I know are all incredibly under the pump in many ways, for taking the time to think about these questions and talking to us about them. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Julieanne. Thanks, Lachlan. Thanks, Sue.
Thanks all.
Sue.
I'm still here, thank you. A couple of people asked for those somewhat hokey slides, and I'll give those to Roger to paste somewhere.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Great conversation.
It's lovely to see you.
Yeah, it's so nice to see everyone.
Yeah, it is
I'll
lovely.
send you a picture of my shoes.
Yes, please, Sue Martin.
I want to see the socks, Sue.
See you later.
All right. Go well, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.